Welcome to Voices of Australia, a podcast where we explore different perspectives on how to build a cohesive society. In a nation where over 300 languages reverberate from homes, workplaces and public spaces, language is more than just a communication tool. It's a cultural lifeline that bridges our diverse communities. Our linguistic diversity isn't just colourful, it's vital and influential. It's a Punjabi radio podcast serving up global affairs alongside local news. It's a crucial health announcement rendered in Somali to ensure every community member is informed. It's the heartwarming banter between a shop owner and customers in Italian across a bustling Lygon Street in Melbourne. This linguistic diversity shapes individual identities, daily experiences, and the character of public discourse. Yet the role and influence of non-English languages continue to prompt discussions that stretched into the heart of cultural integration, societal cohesion, and the concept of belonging. In this episode, we delve into the nuances of Australia's linguistic diversity, exploring the far-reaching impacts from business interactions to media broadcasts and government communications, and their ripple effect on our society's cohesion and shared multicultural story. Our guest today is Pino Migliorino, the founder and managing director of Cultural Perspectives. Pino is known for his extensive experience in ethnic and multicultural affairs and has been a driving force in acknowledging and promoting the richness of Australia's cultural and linguistic diversity. His work focuses on facilitating dialogue between diverse communities and structures interested in diversity, thereby creating a valuable bridge that fosters mutual understanding. With his profound insights, we're set to have an enlightening discussion. Welcome, Pino.
Thank you, Anthea. Very happy to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, especially since you describe yourself as a cultural disruptor. What does that actually mean to you?
Well, to me, it's quite specific. It is about not just accepting systems as they are, but trying to change them so that it will reflect the greater diversity. And my frame of reference is culture, and language is part of culture. So I love the idea. I mean, a disruptor tends to have no framework. An advocate is certainly there, but I actually believe in trying to change the system, and the system itself is then what makes me a cultural disruptor. I quite love that. I mean, and I've invited other people to also identify with that label.
It's a great term. Is there any examples that you've got of over your life experience of a disruption that you've seen occur that's been successful?
I suppose in terms of approaches to things like aged care, certainly the ability to now structure services which meet linguistic and cultural diversity from within communities, actually doing that is very much a change in terms of how aged care used to be delivered before. But there are other major changes here, and we'll talk a lot about them today. The absolute plethora of media, which is now across our airwaves, the ability to actually recognise languages. We test, if NACI, our accreditation authority, tests in over 60 languages. That's about 40 more than any other country in the world. There are just so many things which we have actually disrupted the normal way of doing them to say there is a new legitimacy, there is a new canon, and that canon is diversity.
It is a wonderful thing to travel around any city and in Australia and see the different labelling that occurs in multiple languages, or even the openness of signs on banks and various things that suggest that they've got people who are multilingual in those facilities. Have you ever seen a pushback to that sort of thing happening?
Yes, a very strong one. It was about 15 years ago, and Marrickville Council, of all councils, had a resolution which attempted to be passed that no sign could exist in the municipality without an English translation around it. And many commentators were very supportive of this, and it was really interesting. I thought it was really interesting because ultimately, signage is about marketing and about understanding your audience. And I thought the funniest one, there was a reference to a video shop which sold and rented Vietnamese and at that stage would have been probably Cantonese as well as Mandarin videos. And I just couldn't believe that someone would want to know what it was selling, because the product wasn't for them if they weren't Vietnamese or Chinese speakers. But it got a lot of attention, and it was around whether the mainstream society or the generalist society felt that it should not have access to something, that it was almost exclusive from them. And I think that was an extraordinary cultural debate. But invariably we move on, and there's a sense that language is evolving, and the multiplicity of languages evolve in Australia. And I think it's becoming now de rigueur, and you're getting people actually tattooing themselves with Chinese characters, with Sanskrit. So it's certainly changed.
That's true. It certainly has. But at the same time, there was for a while a myth that if new arrivals were coming here and had come from non-English speaking backgrounds, that the best thing we could do for them was to force them to learn English, to make sure that everything was English, so that they weren't necessarily going, essentially reverting back to a language that they weren't necessarily going to use. And that has changed. There is now, I think, quite a bit of evidence, research evidence, that suggests that in actual fact maintaining your mother tongue actually helps you to learn English as well. Is that your understanding,
Absolutely
Pino?
True. Yeah, the pedagogy around that is quite strong, and the evidence quite strong. And it affects bilingual households. During my time with an organisation called COASIT in Sydney, it's an Italian Welfare and Education Authority or organisation. I was responsible for the development of the first fully bilingual school in Italian and English. It's called the Italian Bilingual School. The pedagogy we followed was that the syllabus would be taught in two languages, and that is one subject. Say you're doing year one English, mathematics, you'd be doing it in English. In year two, you'd be doing mathematics in Italian, as well as doing the language subjects. And what we know is that we actually develop fully bilingual people. And it's the same in mixed cultural marriages, where the evidence suggests that with two parents, if they speak different languages, those parents speaking that language directly to that child means that child develops far quicker. It does take more time then to develop capacity and facility in English, but then the longer term benefits and the cognitive development and the ability to transfer concepts from language to language, it's very, very strong. So I remember telling the teachers that the Italian teachers were not allowed to speak English at all in the school, apart from in the staff room, and the same for the English teachers weren't allowed to speak Italian. And the children really reacted to that, and they got to understand that, and they got to learn in two languages at exactly at the same time. That theory is now being considered for Aboriginal languages as well, as a potential I'm going to say disruptor to some of the disadvantage in terms of the school system, but the Northern Territory government hasn't been that keen. No,
that's true. Now, Pino, is that the way you raised your family? Do you speak Italian at home?
Well, it's a great question. My Italian, I came here as a 4-year-old with full Italian skills, but I lived with a very large family for a number of years with my relatives. We only spoke dialect, so I steadily lost language. So my view has also been that unless you are a speaker of language in its purest sense, that is, you have literacy as well as language, that should not be taught to children. So in my household, my wife's English and my Italian, I would not say is at that level. But in the same way, I insist that my mother only talks to my children in Italian because her English is not going to be great.
But her Italian's excellent.
Yeah, of course. And the kids also were able to avail themselves of Italian language school. Both of my daughters were able to do HSC Italian, and in fact my eldest daughter went on to university studying Italian as well. So the beauty of that is that they are bilingual, and they benefit from that in so many ways, but more it's around how you frame concepts and how you actually, I find at times that I want to say something and it's far better in Italian than in English, and loses in that translation. So that that ability to understand notions from linguistic frameworks is very important to me.
That's an incredibly important point. And I was going to ask you about how linguistic diversity enriches Australian society, but you've really captured it then in what you've talked about, this sense that being able to think and in different languages actually enables you to get frameworks and models in your head of different ways of approaching problems and solutions. Is that one of the benefits of linguistic diversity, and would you point to any others?
Yes, I think it's a really good one, and it's one that actually needs to be unpacked around how we discuss languages. During the 1980s, we had a very big push on languages. A fine academic called Joe LeBlanco was very instrumental under the Hawke government in terms of developing a national languages policy. That tended to suggest that language was important in its own right. And that has, to some extent, been overridden by the economic rationalist approach to saying, well, the only languages we want are those which are going to assist with trade or our economic languages. And we started to develop this notion of economic languages. So all of a sudden, no, don't study Italian, study Indonesian, study Japanese, study Chinese. And what it didn't do is that philosophy didn't actually allow children who could have benefited from learning their own home or heritage language, from feeling part of their families, being able to communicate with their extended families, being able to travel with those languages, feeling proud of that language. We were basically told some languages are good, some languages are not good. And I think we're still fighting that fight. We've lost a huge number of language teachers to our school systems because we've actually preferred some languages over others.
It is an interesting point when you think about how multicultural we are, that in actual fact we haven't created more roles for multilingual individuals to volunteer within schools as well. There are just a wealth of opportunities for bringing in diverse thinking, diverse ways of articulating thought and learning new languages that can come simply because you've got a diverse community around you. But somehow or other we think we've just got to have teachers that teach it. And I recognise the importance of that training. But at the same time, just exposing people to other languages in whatever way you can is valuable.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, Anthea. There is a huge movement now at the local library level where you have story time in different languages, and you invite family in, and especially out of Victoria with 3-year-old kindergarten, 4-year-old kindergarten, a really big push that if we're going to actually take young children into early childhood education, we need to understand that their language or their home language is going to be really important. But what happens is that there's this absolute legitimacy before school, and as soon as we go into formal schooling, and then we get this range of narratives saying, oh, the curriculum is overcrowded, they need to learn this, learn to learn this, and languages fall by the wayside. So it's really interesting. We're legitimised it in terms of early childhood, but we tend to make it a lot more difficult as we're going through the schooling system, that we're not actually valuing it, especially when compared to the push on STEM or the push on general English literacy.
I think also that the formality and the competitiveness of schooling, especially secondary schooling, tends to take a lot of the fun out of learning a language, that you become all caught up with the specifics of how to pronounce or what goes before or after a particular word and that sort of thing. Whereas the informality of being exposed to language and just picking up things is still a really valuable way of highlighting that this is an important part of Australian society and that we can all enjoy it in some way, shape or form.
Yes, absolutely. I agree totally.
Now, you had mentioned earlier when we first started talking about multicultural marketing and how important using language as a way of being able to communicate with the various customers that you might have is really quite relevant. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about multicultural marketing and what it is that perhaps businesses these days are not tapping into when they think about the diverse society. Are they simply saying, well, we do it this way, therefore we're trying to we'll continue to do it regardless of where you come from? Or are they actually being more nuanced and tailored?
You'd think that the theory around multicultural marketing is derived from that early thinking around multicultural affairs, looking at the social and the economic impact. It was called productive diversity under Paul Keating when he was there. So he framed this whole discussion around the value of diversity. Now, from a marketer's perspective, there are two frames of reference. One is, well, before we get to the two frames of reference, the reality is the population is highly diverse. And even if they do speak English, they do still live within cultural frameworks and cultural communities. I know myself, we've just recently done out of the company a series of videos on the social model of disability. And we had a person from a Hindi background say, where's our Hindi piece? And I said, well, but the data says that 97% of your community speaks English well. But it didn't matter. They wanted it in language. So that is the reality. The reality is we have a demography which is multilingual and multicultural. From a perspective of businesses or even government, then there are a number of things that need to take place. The first frame of reference is to say, well, if what we are doing or producing is this, who is it most relevant to? And understanding that if I'm selling children's products, that the child rate in ethnic communities is far stronger and higher than other communities. There may be greater needs, more than their presence in the community. It actually might be enhanced. So should I be actually telling them about my products because they are going to require them more than other communities? So Australia has a birth rate of 1.7. The ethnic communities scale up really strongly. Arabic about 3.2. The Pacific Island communities, they about 5. And to get to the African communities, we're looking at 7 or 8 kids per family. So there's an economic argument that says there may be some products which are absolutely apt for certain markets or certain segments of that market. So it's understanding how big they are, what languages they speak, where they live, what media they're consuming. Then there's, sorry.
No. Well, I was just thinking it is really interesting, isn't it? The tailored marketing and the use of data in order to highly tailor where you market is something that's been discussed at least for the last 10 years or so. And yet I'm just wondering, what's the fear, do you think, that exists within marketers? Is it lack of knowledge and a lack of multicultural staff that actually don't know how to deal with language and don't know how to deal with these more nuanced communities that is stopping them? Because the logic must be there in their brains. There's just something that they haven't figured out.
It's a perfect question. And to some extent, I have to blame the industry itself, that is the advertising, the communications, public relations industry. They are very strongly monocultural. And they do have second geners from different backgrounds, but they're not employed for their cultural background. They're employed for the skill sets they bring to work in the English market. So there is an inherent lack of, one, an understanding or exposure, but secondly, in terms of how to actually utilize it. So it's a skill deficit. So I find it really interesting in terms of how precise you can be. We've recently had a small outbreak of Japanese encephalitis virus. We were taken on by a government Department of Health to promote the need for caution as well as where to get immunisations from. So what we were able to do is actually look at where the outbreaks were, who has access to or lives near either piggeries or water courses, and we were able to define a really specific set of markets which wouldn't be your traditional Italian, Greek, Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, Vietnamese, kind of like the top 6. None of those are in that mix. And I think that's where the beauty is. So the question is, what's stopping people? What's stopping people is, one, a lack of personal framing around this existence. They see the diversity as something you go into, a meal in Chinatown, or that you go and enjoy, rather than how people are actually living their lives. So I think we've got a lot further to go in terms of who owns the ability to reflect our images and to develop our communications.
Absolutely. I think you made some really important points there. But one of that example that you just gave about the Japanese encephalitis communications, there are a number of different, whether it's during COVID or even coming up with the voice referendum, this the importance of simply getting knowledge out to communities is really vital in so many different respects. Do you think that at a government level, and I know you'll have to be circumspect about how you answer this, but do you think we're really getting to understand the importance of that linguistic diversity and communications channels at a government level?
I have to say yes. And the example I'll give, when I first started working in this field about 30 years ago, the government approach to communications was a quota. They indicated when I first started 5% of media spend had to go to ethnic media. To some extent, it was application of the ethnic media. But it did create some opportunities. In the last couple of years, though, and it's now 2 years, the federal government has actually developed a different way of procurement where it actually uses villages. And in every village, there is a multicultural and an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander expert. And we get to sit at the table to actually do these communications. So I think it in part is also a response to what happened in COVID, where people realised that just translating information was not going to be enough. You needed to actually be able to speak in the language of the community, not just the language itself, but how it's delivered, who delivers it, what is the face and the credential of the person delivering it. How do we actually deal with then individual communities where there may be resistance? And that ability to actually say, a communication on its own will not be effective across the board. Mm-hmm. We actually need to be able to tailor it, nuance it, and deliver it to meet where the community is at. And that ability then it requires a little bit more work. You actually have to go and speak to communities, find out about them, understand their comforts. So I find it really interesting in the Italian community. You can talk about people's backaches and any type of problem, even things like bowel movement, bowel cancer, and everyone's comfortable. But try to talk about dementia, try to talk about mental health, try to talk about sexual diversity, try to talk about a number of disability, and there are really strong resistances. So in our practice, we do talk about a diversity, and it's not really a diversity, it's called a sensitivity filter. If something's not sensitive, like immunising children, there are no barriers to actually communicating. You can be quite didactic. But if something is culturally sensitive, you have to actually take a different frame and say, we need to actually understand how it's spoken about, what people think, what people feel, and then work through community structures or individuals who can lead the discussion from the inside, because coming from the outside looks like we're actually telling off the community. We're actually victimizing the community.
That's a really interesting point, and incredibly important. And I'll raise one thing with you, Pino. I'm not sure if you're aware of the fact that in the referendum, when people are actually there to vote, they have to write the word yes or write the word
Correct.
No. And
Correct.
And so this is going to be one of those incredibly important points, as you say, to get through, and the cultural nuances of help people learning to write yes or no in English, simply to be able to be, have their vote counted at the referendum. I'm assuming this is one of those things where there are cultural nuances about how you communicate that need, but also how do you deliver the mechanisms by which people can learn to do that.
Exactly. And I'm the perfect person to ask, because I have the responsibility given to us by the AEC to develop those communications. We'll be developing material in 34 languages, and the issue you identify that people have to write yes and no is a major issue. It is a major issue. But it's also a bigger issue in terms of what does referendum mean? Yeah. What does a double majority mean? Majority of states and majority of people. There are some real fundamental concepts that we'll have to work too. And part of that is working with linguistic experts, translators who are very, very good and qualified, and working out in X language, what is the best way to do it? How do we position the English word and still create a translated meaning? What happens when there's not a direct translation? Yeah. So it really is a nuanced understanding of the linguistic capacities and the words that are used, and translating them in the substantive sense, not literal but substantive, that actually is going to deliver people the knowledge. So you think about referendum. We know it fairly clearly. What does it mean for someone who's recently here? The voice itself, what is it? So the role that Cultural Perspectives will play will be working for the AEC. We're politically neutral. We won't be pushing the yes or no case, but we will be strongly involved in letting people know exactly what's going to be required from them, what the referendum is, and how to actually participate in it. And I think it's a fundamental part of democracy in Australia. And I've got to say, the Australian Electoral Commission have been outstanding. I've now worked on 10 elections and 2 referendum and even the East Timorese election. So there's a lot of experience there, and we work very hard to make sure that people are equipped so that they can fulfil their democratic opportunity and right.
Pino, personally, you are an excellent communicator. I wondered if maybe you could share what you think are the guiding principles in making these sort of complex processes like the referendum accessible to multicultural communities. What are the sort of 2 or 3 principles that all of us should actually be applying when we're thinking about communications?
It's really good. It's a great question. I think the first principle is understand that there is going to be difference across your ethnic communities. So the ability to take one message and just translate it is not going to necessarily work. That we need to understand that there are huge differences by literacy. There are some people highly, highly literate, brilliant, and they can do many languages, and others who would have come here with a primary school education and predominantly receive information orally. So one is an acceptance that there's diversity within that diversity. Secondly, the other principle is really understanding the market. I say that people say to me, we need to get a campaign out, what ethnic media should we use? And I say, we're not going to talk about ethnic media. What is it you want to achieve? Who do you want to target? And then what we do is we overlay demographic analysis, any existing evidence. Is there an underrepresented representation of certain women in breast screening? Well, that's really important. What is the age framework for breast screening? Mm-hmm. That's really important. So you actually start building then this nuanced approach. It's only at that point where you've identified what you want to communicate and who you want to communicate to. Then you say, okay, if they're our targets, what is the best way of them communicating with them? How do they receive information, process information? So then the other thing is, it's not a one approach fits all. I need to be able to say there are some communities who are highly literate, written form, online works brilliantly. Others where oral messaging and indeed supported messaging through intermediaries is going to work. So that's the second principle. And I think the third principle, given that you have limited me to 3, which is great, is actually engaging with the communities to see how they want to be spoken to.
Yeah.
It's all very well saying, I can understand it, I can develop the best strategy, and then at field or when you try to implement it, just doesn't work. It might be because I failed to understand a nuance. I failed to understand that by doing something here, I've actually alienated this other part of the community, because in the community there are divisions. So I'm not going to understand that unless I actually spend the time to get to know the communities.
Now, you raised that earlier, and I really want to draw on your experience as a board member of the National Suicide Prevention Office, because suicide is an incredibly difficult conversation to have with anybody at any point in time. Are there particular things that you're helping to encourage the office to think through when they're actually dealing with suicide prevention?
Yeah, there are a few actually. The first is suicide prevention is made a little bit difficult because of the data sources. Where is it happening? Is it something we should be equipping the whole community to have better mental health so that then they're not going to be as likely to be have suicidal thoughts? That's all very important, but there's a limitation of data, and mainly because those who collect the data are the actual funeral homes and the undertakers who actually have to record ethnicity on the forms, and they don't. In many jurisdictions that don't exist. So my thing is to say, all right, rather than worry about a large scale data source, let's consider what aspects of people's lives would make them most vulnerable. A refugee arrival is a vulnerability. What are the supports around it? We already know in our settlement area that the humanitarian programs, the HSP, the torture and trauma services are all geared towards that. So what we then should start looking at is, are there actually subgroups groups within the communities who may indeed be more vulnerable to suicidality because of their circumstances. And it's a really interesting one because most of the work works on the life course, kids leaving school, moving into relationships, moving out of employment, moving into non-work in terms of the older area. And we know that one of the largest groups who are actually suiciding are people who are in their late years, 70s to 80s. It's a major crisis. So then my advice is, how do we actually look at where we need to put in the preventative measures so that people have got support that makes sense to them, so that if you like, their mental health is kept well and their wellness is a priority, so that we don't get people who become vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as an aside, Pino, I'm curious about data, and I have a particular view, but I'm not necessarily going to share that with you because I'd really like your sort of unaffected view. Data or measurement of ethnicity, if you like, tends to be one of those go-to things at the moment that everybody, whether it's a business or whatever, it's all about, oh no, we need to collect data, we need to know where people are from. But what you've created or outlined is how important it is in specific circumstances.
Correct.
Do you have a view about this data collection? Is collecting ethnicity regardless just important because then we've got it? Or is it more about what do you actually want to use the data for?
Well, I think it is the latter. Part of the data discussion is around privacy and whether the data collected could be used against people because it could actually identify them. I'm a real believer in our privacy principles, and there are 9 of them, but the one that makes most sense to me is that you don't collect data unless there's a purpose, and the person who's providing the data understands the purpose. Yeah. So if you ask a lot of people, write down all your details, they'll go, well, I'm not that comfortable. But if you say, write down all your details, and this because we're going to use this information for this purpose and this is how it's actually going to benefit you, then they'll be a lot more comfortable with it. We do, there are some extreme aspects of this in terms of data collection. For me, over now 40 years of practice, 30 years in private practice, the language spoken at home for me is one of the best de facto identifiers of ethnicity, and I've been able to prove it a couple of times as well. When we started asking the first questions around ancestry, I was able to do a cross-tabulation between the ancestry question and the language spoken at home by country of birth. It's a bit esoteric talking about that, but what was really interesting is that country of birth wasn't enough because people speak different languages. Languages wasn't enough because we actually don't know enough about them. By actually then analysing how people identified themselves and then comparing that with an ancestry, they correlated. And so it's really interesting that during a census, people write, do you speak a language other than English? Yes. At home. What language? Even if they're almost native English speakers, they'll identify that as an ethnicity indicator, not an ancestry indicator, but a lived ethnicity indicator. And the ethnic media, a part of this as well, they'll tell their communities how to answer the demographic questions in the census to be able to get the numbers up, because then the more numbers you have. So as you can see, it's a complex area. But for me, if you're looking to create a service or sell a product, understanding the community is important, and that's demographic data from the census, then there is an aspect of how well have I tapped into that market? How well am I selling that product? How effective is my screening program? I can only know that if I actually can then compare the diversity, the ethnic diversity of my client base with the potential. And that gap is then very important.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and can completely see it from a marketing perspective. I think my concern is certainly within businesses, the amount of profiling, if you like, that they're doing of their staff, and asking them to identify their particular ethnic heritage and what that might be, with actually no intent of doing anything in particular. They just want to know it so that they can report it and say, gee whiz, aren't we terrific? We've got this diversity, rather than actually thinking about how do we utilise that to build the culture that we want to have within this organisation. So.
Well, And can I add to that, because it's such a good point, there are two ways of considering that staff diversity. One is an EEO, equal opportunity one, where we try to remove barriers so talented people, regardless of their background, can come in.
Yeah.
Then the other one is a really important one as well. To what extent is our linguistic and cultural asset base in an organisation going to assist us do the work we do and frame it around the clients? And I think that's right. If you're just collecting it for reporting purposes, and as we know in those big private companies, even though you've got a whole lot of diversity, it is an objective fact. It's not a material relevance to what's actually being done. It's not like you're using, I won't mention any accounting firms, but it's not like you're using the breadth of that diversity to actually enhance practice or to open new markets. It's just the fact you've got diversity. So I'm very much of a view that there needs to be a purpose for it.
Absolutely.
Is the purpose equal employment? Then that's fine. Is it improving your capacity to provide better services? Then that's an imperative.
Pino, time has flown by, but in actual fact, no, but I have one last question, which I'm sure won't be a short one. But you're very involved with Netball Australia, and I'm quite interested to know whether or not you've experienced multilingual or different languages being used in netball. Because I've seen writings that you've done about the role of sport, people's those that aren't necessarily engaged, whether it's in netball or other sports, who don't have any familiarity with sport anyway. So how do you go about communicating what this is and what the benefit is? And then when they join, is there this, have you experienced anywhere this sort of multilingual capacity by coaches or other players to nurture netballers?
It's an interesting one, netball, because I must admit it's like many organisations where their heritage is from a narrow range of cultures. So I've looked at netball and I've understood there was some money made available by Australia Post for a broader multicultural sports program, and during that there was a program called One Netball, and I sat on an advice group for that. It was great. It was really interesting. It created some wonderful activities. It did focus on diversity, but what it did fail to do is to actually say, what is netball? Who runs netball? How accommodating is netball? So the netball clubs at the local level are small fiefdoms, and they're very, very hard to change. And so because they're so hard to change, the sense that they're open to diversity is questionable. So allowing girls to wear a hijab while they play, it doesn't happen everywhere. Modification of dress doesn't happen everywhere. It's not that accommodating. And it's for that reason, to some extent, netball is not developing the multicultural base that it could do, because it hasn't actually worked the principles of diversity through its system. It has states and they're very autonomous. It has clubs and they're very autonomous. And the way to achieve change is to have to do it collaboratively. You have to show the benefit. And at the moment, there is a real selection. When I go out, and I've had two daughters, right? So I've spent many, many Saturdays over many years at netball. What I see very interestingly, I see there is an ethnicity there, but they tend to be a second or third generation, and they are the mothers who might have started playing netball but want their daughters to, and that's Lebanese, Greek, Italian. There's a fairly strong push there. But funnily enough, the fathers are pushing for the girls to play soccer or football. And I've said to the sports, if you look at and I mentioned some data before about the number of children in non-English families. If you look at where our demography is going, unless you engage with those children, they will not be going to your sport, and you will become smaller. It's a negative result, because the reality is they represent such a large amount. So I thought it was great what Netball Australia was doing, but it was only doing it once it had resources which were made available to it. It wasn't intrinsic to the organisation, and I think that's in the telling as well. So I'd hate to be so crass as to say, if I look at the Australian netball team, I think they're a wonderful, wonderful group of sports people. But if I look at the diversity within them, there is hardly any. And that's our issue.
absolutely. Well, I have a dream of a South Korean coach teaching a South Korean team of netballers and in South Korean. It would be rather wonderful.
Yeah, and in fact, you asked, do I hear other languages on the netball court? No, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least we're seeing that AFL games are now being broadcast in different languages. So,
isn't that brilliant?
Really
I
terrific.
think it's extraordinary.
And wonderful to listen to if you ever get the chance. Pino, it's just been absolute delight to talk with you. I'm so appreciated this time, and you've shared so many great ideas for anybody to actually incorporate into their lives. So I really appreciate you. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And it's been so comfortable. I've really appreciated it.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. Well, hi, Matt. As our intercultural communications intern here from Monash University, we're delighted to have you share in listening to this podcast and giving some feedback at the end of it.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Incredible conversation with Pino. Such an interesting character and such a great experience that he's had in the work that he's doing.
He's really been a pioneer in this space of really helping people to better understand how to embrace linguistic diversity and put it into practice, particularly from a marketing perspective, of course. But he brought up a whole lot of different things that we should think about and encourage others to think about.
Absolutely, especially for me as a newcomer to Australia. I've only been here for a few months, so getting that kind of context of the multilingualism and what that means for Australian culture is particularly interesting. A few of the things he said really stood out to me. So I remember at one point he said that there's a new legitimacy, and that is diversity of linguistics, of diversity of language, and really how that kind of then translates to Australian culture being a multilingual culture. And that really is something that I've picked up on a lot, but to hear it put in that terms is really interesting, really fascinating. But then within that as well, it's not just, here we are as one big multilingual society. There's diversity within the diversity itself.
Yeah.
And the importance of localizing language and understanding the localized language. It's really interesting topics.
And the nuances of communication that have a cultural overlay on the linguistic. So just because you might be presenting something in Hindi doesn't mean you can necessarily present the same fact to everybody in the same way. You've really got to understand intergenerational dynamics or the variations of interpretations of certain words as well.
Absolutely. When he talked about having that kind of sensitivity filter, that cultural sensitivity filter, it's not just the words that you're saying, it's how you broach the topic even. Absolutely fascinating, really insightful.
I thought when the way he talks about it really does help to build a sense of pride in Australia's embracing of that multilingualism, and hopefully we can see a few more of those sort of barriers breaking down from a big business perspective, that they'll start to orient their own particular marketing techniques into areas with a little bit more of professionalism, if you like.
Not just professionalism, just a reflection of the actual use of these languages. Again, Pino said something about who is it who owns the availability for these languages, and being more reflective of the actual diversity of the communities. That's something that businesses have to take on if they want to survive, surely.
Oh, you would think so.
Yeah, you would hope so. I would also be really interested to see, he's been working in this field for so long. What has the kind of cultural shift been over the years and how people think about languages and how they approach them, especially when people like him are working in this space to really push the acceptance of diversity forward?
Oh, and it was great to see him be so positive about government's approach to communications and multilingual communications, even if perhaps business is a little bit further behind. But it was really great that he felt so positive about that work. And of course, the Australian Electoral Commission really embracing it in this particular point in time. So,
yeah.
great.
Really, really interesting stuff, especially when you think that the ties between language and culture and identity are so strong. So being able to have that acceptance of different languages means it's only going to be positive for your own culture and your own sense of identity.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Absolutely. No, I'm just delighted to do this particular podcast. I think we've all got something to take away from it. So it's going to be really, really exciting to figure out where will we move on to from here. So
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Voices of Australia podcast, brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by me, Faisal Farah, and with audio, visual, recording and editing by John Bigelow from Interactive Media Solutions. Research for each episode is provided by Agalos Makdijojos and Matthew Skidmore. Original music is by Steve Klapsinos. Learn more about the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and all its works by visiting the website www.scanloninstitute.org.au.